Hello, chefs. This is Chef's PSA Podcast. I'm your host, André Natera. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the differences between cooks and chefs. Stay tuned. So on today's episode, what we're going to get into is we're going to talk about the differences between a chef and a cook, and we're going to expand upon the old expression, a chef can cook, but a cook can't chef. And what does that really mean? Also, at the very end, I'm going to tell you what my top 5 cookbooks are, because a lot of people have been asking me, what are the 5 cookbooks that I recommend? So wait till the end, and I'll make sure I tell you what my top 5 favorite cookbooks that influenced me are. Now, before we begin, a brief update. I just released Food Cost Mastery. It's a free ebook. You could find a link in the description below. It's a companion to the 3-part episode I did on Food Cost Mastery. So hopefully you go back and listen to that. If you want to learn all about food cost, the ebook basically summarizes what was in the podcast with maybe a little bit extra and maybe a little bit more polished because, sometimes I just get lost in thought bubbles. Go check that out. It's free. It's free education. Why would you say no to something that's free? Or you could pay me. I mean, I do appreciate a little donation to the cause. Always appreciated. Go to chefspsa.com/books to see all the books. Everything's in the show notes. And if you want to support the show, there's a link in Spotify where you could donate, and all donations are appreciated. I also have just released the Bad Sue Good Chef book in Italian. So for those of you that were waiting for the Italian version, that is out. I'm finishing translating the last 2, which is Line Cook Survival Manual, which I'm working on currently. I'm more than halfway done. And then the last one, the Red Book, The Biggest Idiot in the Kitchen, will be done. And I'm going to pump the brakes for a little bit after that. I'm working on 2 other ebooks. I'll announce those soon. And then one last update. For those of you that were asking, the How to Manage Like an Executive Chef class, it's exclusively available on my YouTube channel. So if you want to watch that class, a lot of you have seen the Instagram reels with me in a suit talking nonsense about menus or food cost or whatever. That's available on YouTube. I'm putting up the whole class. 2 episodes are up. Episode 1 and episode 2 I just put out on kitchen culture. Episode 3 a little bit later this week. Anyway, we digress. The subject matter. What's the difference between a cook and a chef? So the expression a chef can cook, but a cook can't chef, basically is that contrary to popular belief, every chef most likely started out as a cook. I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, and people are going to slide in my DMs saying, I know a guy that, graduated from culinary school and his parents bought him a restaurant. Okay, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but an exception doesn't disprove the rule. Most chefs started in kitchens and worked their way up, regardless of culinary or formal training. So they have the ability to cook, but they also have something extra. And that is the ability to run the brigade or lead the kitchen. In French, the term chef translates as leader. So the way that we're going to use chef in today's context for the podcast versus cook is a cook will be someone that works a station on the line. So, the saute cook, the grill cook, the veg cook, the entremet, the pastry cook, the prep cook. That's what we mean by cooks. And when I'm speaking of chefs, I'm talking about the person who is leading. The person who's leading the brigade, making the decisions, and ultimately holds responsibility over the restaurant or the culinary operation. There's the expression, we're all cooks, but we're not all chefs. And I know a lot of chefs sometimes renounce the title, out of a sense of humility, saying, I'm just a cook, I'm not a chef. We're not going to get into that today. I know a lot of people will just say, no, I don't wear the fancy chef coat, I just wear a t-shirt. Or, I don't have embroidery on my coat. We're not talking about that. We're talking today in context, the difference between someone that's leading the kitchen versus someone that's not, and what are some of those differences. What's interesting is when I was coming up, and again, times were different, but saying someone was a cook could be a compliment or it could also be a pejorative. And I'll tell you what I mean. Like I said earlier, sometimes chefs would be like, no, I'm just a cook. I just want to get behind the stove, pots and pans, and make delicious food. We're all cooks at heart. And then other times, like if someone wasn't good at what they did, you would just say, oh, that person's they're just a cook. They're not a chef, right? And it was meant to be a subtle dig at them in terms of skill level. They would say things like, stop acting like a cook. So when we're talking about what some of the big differences are, a lot of times people will say the expression, a chef doesn't run in the kitchen, a cook runs. And that usually has to do with the fact that they're calm, they're efficient. A chef shows up exactly where they need to be when they're supposed to be there. When I was a chef, I used to have one of my sous chefs. I'd pop into the kitchen and I'd like right when the kitchen was crashing, I would show up, because at this point in time I had multiple kitchens that I oversaw, and I would just show up right in the kitchen right when it was crashing, and then help them get through the push of service. And then my sous chef would come up to me like, "How do you know to show up on time all the time? Like you have this instinct." And I said, "You know what? My chef force, right?" So I jokingly use the term chef force. It's like this instinct that chefs has. It's this sixth sense, whether it's with cooking or knowing where to be at a certain time, or sometimes your chef instinct will go off and say that person's going to quit. They're not coming back from vacation, or whatever the case may be. Like you start to pick up on things intuitively. It's what I call the chef force, right? And I would tell my sous chef, I just know my intuition based on who's on the schedule, how many covers we have, who's working, who's running the service team, the weather, I don't know, doing that. I just know that I probably needed to be in the kitchen. And sure as shit, I did. I'd show up and boom, they needed me. That's the difference between a chef and a cook, is the chef is thoughtful of where they need to be and where everyone else needs to be. The chef moves efficiently. The chef uses time management, not just to manage their time, but also to manage the time of the team and move them around. Chefs make lists. Chefs order food. Chefs write schedules. Chefs sit down two cooks and stop them from arguing. Chefs sometimes have to write a menu on the fly, right? Now, I'm working on a project. I won't get too into it, but I had to write a menu really quick this past week. And I haven't written, start to finish menu. And this is for, something they want like to be a top restaurant in the city. And I was like, okay, sure, done. I turned it around in less than a day, half a day of writing a menu, right? 4 or 5 hours in front of a computer, boom. I'm pretty happy with the way the menu came out. But a lot of times, I've talked with cooks in my career. I'll say, I need you to come up with a special, and they struggle. Like, I don't know what to do. They're really good at the line and they know how to cook, but sometimes when it comes to the creative process, that's also sometimes the difference between the cook and the chef. And that's not bad, because a lot of people do enjoy the being on the line. They don't want the responsibility. They don't want to move up. And managing a brigade, different brigades, different size, that's stressful. Chefs sometimes age very quickly because of the amount of stress that they're dealing with. And this is something that not a lot of people see. They don't see the chaos behind the scenes. They don't see that it's constant problem after problem after problem. They don't see that you're checking your phone in the middle of the night and tomorrow's your day off. And then you realize you got to come in because a certain cook called off and there's no one that could cover. And you've been working 20 days straight. And then you call the one person that always has 2 days off and you say, hey, it's my only day off tomorrow and I have plans with my family. Can you cover for me? Or can you cover this cook? And they say, sorry, I'm busy too. Right? So a lot of people don't see some of the chaos that the chef has to deal with. And trust me, from experience, I'm telling you, it's probably the most difficult thing. Cooking sometimes is the easy part. And when I was running kitchens, sometimes I would prefer, like, just put me on a board, put me on the pass, let me call service. I'd rather do that than have to deal with some of the problems that I have to deal with on a daily basis. And that's sometimes what separates, a cook from a chef. And like I said, not bad, just different. It brings me to that thing. Everyone's a chef. I cook at home. I make a TikTok video. I'm a chef, right? No, you're a home cook, or you're cooking for Instagram. If someone asked me today, and I'm cautious about this because a lot of people still call me chef, and I recognize that it's a term of respect, but to me, chef is the title. And I'm not leading a brigade right now. Maybe Chef's PSA is the brigade, right? Chef's PSA army out there. Maybe they look at me as chef, but I'm not leading a team. If I was to take a job and I walk into a kitchen and they hire me to be the fry cook, I'm not going to walk around and say, well, you got to call me chef because I've been a chef before and I went to culinary school and I've been an executive chef 9 times. They're going to say, none of that matters. That person over there is the chef and you're the fry cook. And I have to accept it because the chef in certain places is the title. It's the person that is responsible. Now, when we look at the French brigade system, the term chef means leader, as we talked about earlier. And the head chef was the chef de cuisine, the chef of the kitchen, the person who's running the culinary team. That's the chef de cuisine. Here in the United States, you see the term executive chef thrown around a lot, meaning, they're the executive, they're the head boss, right? Same principle applies. But then you have your demi chef, your chef de partie, your chef commis, and so on and so forth, your chef patisserie, etc. So all of these are different positions that are also running certain teams. So the chef de partie usually runs a team of demi chefs or chef commis, etc. A sous chef typically runs chef de parties. Maybe you have an executive sous chef, and a lot of hierarchies like junior sous chef, senior sous chef, executive sous chef, assistant executive sous chef. I don't know. Some of these titles get wild out there. But anyway, you get the point. A chef is usually the person who's leading a brigade. So then you look at like social media influencers, like I'm a home chef. It's like, well, I don't fucking go around and say I'm a home doctor because I prescribe myself Tylenol or anything like that. So it's kind of disrespectful to the profession, right? And I think on a certain level, we need to bring that professionalism back to the culinary industry, because anyone with a TikTok account and some spaghetti and Velveeta can call themselves a chef, and it's kind of ridiculous. Like, I didn't have such a problem with it before, but now it's starting to get to the point where everyone's just bastardizing the term chef and they're just throwing it around. And anyone that's making a sink full of noodles with taco sauce is calling them a chef. I love watching chef reactions. I find that guy hilarious, and some of his quips are like just spot on and on point, super sarcastic. I love watching. Anyway, we digress. One last thing I'm going to say when it comes to chefs, and this might be like, when I say this, all the cooks are going to be like, yeah, we know, right? And it's a big truth. That is, the head chef, the chef de cuisine or executive chef in the kitchen is not necessarily always the best cook. They're not paid to be the best cook. I think Alain Ducasse has a quote where he says, the chef doesn't need to be the best cook in the kitchen. They need to be the best taster. They need to have the best palate, which goes back to my point. A chef can cook, but a cook can't chef. The cook may be able to execute, but the chef is the one who's able to create and correct. And with experience, have a lot of solutions to the problems which may arise. I might be wrong. Maybe everyone is a chef. So back to the point that I was trying to make is, a lot of times the sous chef or the chef de cuisine, if there's a multi-layered like executive chef, chef de cuisine, or sometimes there's just a really strong cook in the kitchen that is like the best cook on the line and also maybe the driving force behind the menu creation. It's not necessarily always the chef. I mean, look, I'm going to dispel a myth for a lot of people that think you're going to go into Gordon Ramsay's restaurant in Las Vegas and find him. Probably not there, and he probably has a corporate chef or a chef de cuisine in that particular restaurant that writes the menus. That's the reality of it. And I promise you, a lot of very large, big-name chefs do the same thing. I promise you, Guy Fieri and Bobby Flay are not on the line in their restaurants. Guy Fieri's not making the donkey sauce. Sorry to disappoint. I don't even know what donkey sauce is. I mean, it's probably tasty. It's worth a fortune. And then I should say, just to kind of wrap up the chef versus cook, is I would say, if you want to become a chef, if you're just starting out, and like I said, maybe in your kitchen, everyone is called chef, because I know I've worked in those places where it's just a term of professionalism and we all call each other chef. We all say, yes, chef. Even if the person who's calling the pass isn't a chef, we'd say, yes, chef, or we chef, out of respect because they are in charge, right? So maybe that's the type of kitchen you work in. So I'm not trying to discredit it. Like I said, for this podcast in particular, I'm using the difference between the person who's leading the brigade versus the person who's working on the stations. But if you want to go from cook to chef, understand that the biggest thing that needs to happen, one, I should say the gatekeeper is always, you need to be good with food. At a certain level, you need to be the best cook in the kitchen, or at least towards the tip of the spear. But the rest of it is the leadership qualities. Being able to look at a problem, whether it be a people problem or a food problem, and knowing how to correct it. Looking at the service line and saying, service would be much more efficient if we changed this, this, and this. That is how a chef thinks. A chef is thinking far ahead. They understand that the decisions that they're making are going to affect more than just themselves. They affect the entire team. They affect the finances. They affect ownership. They affect the guests. And a chef understands that the decisions that are made today, they may have to suffer the consequences of that long term. Anyway, now on to the other thing. 5 books that I think for me were the most influential. I might not do exactly 5, but the reason I'm doing this is because I get a lot of DMs saying, can you recommend some books? So here we go. These are the books that I recommend that influenced me. So understand that the era that I came up in is slightly different than the current era. So some of the books may seem a little bit dated, but these were the books that influenced me. Okay, I'm going to give you 10 books. I'm going to give you 5 that influenced me and then 5 maybe a little bit more recently. So the first book that I would put at the top of the heap for me, French Laundry Cookbook. I think so many chefs say that this is the book that influenced them the most because it was the first book in that era that had the beautiful pictures, the stories, the narrative, the precise recipes. And to understand, like the food in the French Laundry Cookbook when it first came out, I don't know when it came out, 1999 or whatever, it was light years ahead of everything else. Not even close. The photography, the imagery, honestly, still to this day, I would say of all the cookbooks, it's still for me number 1. Number 2, Charlie Trotter. And there was a whole series of Charlie Trotter books, but the one that I would put on the list was the book Charlie Trotter. I think it's maroon or purple. It was so beautiful. Also, again, beautiful photos. It didn't have the same amount of stories as the French Laundry Cookbook, but the recipes were super interesting. And back then, the food that Charlie Trotter was doing was like the equivalent of like what Noma's doing today, what he was doing with vegetables and all that. Go watch the Charlie Trotter documentary. Very good. It's a time capsule of how great things were. Number 3, White Heat, Marco Pierre White, gangster book. He looked so cool. Every single chef wanted to be Marco Pierre White back in the day. He had that, the black and white photos. There's a photo with him on a shark and smoking a cigarette and, looking like a rock star. Marco Pierre White, honestly, that book, one of the best cookbooks out there. It's small. It's not as large as like the French Laundry or Charlie Trotter. It had fewer recipes, but outstanding book. And then the imagery. And look, back then, you were cool if you had the Marco Pierre White cookbook. Next was Alain Ducasse's Culinary Encyclopedia, Grand Livre de Cuisine, giant book. Back then it was like $250. I don't know how much it is now. And I remember I had to save up as a cook to get it. It was big. I don't know. It's like 500 pages. And then the recipes are just like beautiful photos, detailed recipes, and it goes on forever. Great book. It was like only gangsters had that book. Like cool kids had the Marco Pierre White book, but like only gangsters had Alain Ducasse's book. And then number 5, I would say Joel Robuchon's L'Atelier book. It was really well done. I remember I got it, and it's a book with many chefs that worked under him, and the food is beautiful, and the technique is sharp, and of course he's famous for the Robuchon potatoes. One of the greatest chefs to have ever lived. I'd recommend that book. Now, books that are, I hate to say more modern, but maybe in the last 10 or 15 years modern. I don't know if we could even say that, but shit. Anyway, Noma, I'm going to put that up there as probably the number 1 of the in the modern section. What René Redzepi did. Besides the ants, I don't know if I'm into ants, but anyway, besides the ants, René Redzepi had one of the most brilliant books. He was the first one to start introducing the foraging and that Nordic style plating, at least first time I saw it, and the fermentation and all that, like just great. You could maybe you could argue that maybe the fermentation book could compete for that, but nonetheless, Noma, I'd put that right at the top. I should say, maybe I could have argued the new French Laundry per se also, because I think the new French Laundry per se is just as good as the original French Laundry. It's the updated version with a lot of newer techniques in there, where they're talking about, the prehydrated xanthan gum or the veg blanc that they use to cook vegetables in. So there's a lot more detail. We get really granular on brining fish. And anyway, the French Laundry per se book, really great book. Highly recommend that one. I would put that in there too. Octophilosophy by Andre Chang. Great book. I've read it cover to cover. Really enjoyed it. He's got an interesting way to think about food and some of the flavor combinations he pulls. So when I read a cookbook, I read it end to end. I don't just look at the pictures. I read every single recipe and I put a bookmark where I left off. And when you start to read some of the recipes in Octa Philosophy, it's like he takes some very simple ideas and then like, oh, I would have never thought to put that in there. I wish I could give you a good example, but I'm making this up. Maybe it's like miso and the kale puree or something like that. But he was always taking something that looked visually beautiful, but then you read the recipe, it's like, oh, I would have never thought that. Really good book. 11 Madison Park, you could argue which one was better. When the 11 Madison Park book came out, the first one, I loved it. I thought that the photos were beautiful. It was one of the best books at the time when it came out, and you could say it was like the book when it came out. Obviously, super talented chefs that work there. Great restaurants, the number one restaurant for a reason. And the book shows why. And also, not on the cookbook list, but Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara, great book. Honestly, one of the best books I've read. Big time into culture, and I think it's one of those books that if you're in the industry, whether you're a chef or you're on the service side, you should be reading that book, Unreasonable Hospitality. But not on this list. That's a different list for another day. Last one, it's tough for me to say, but because I don't know if this could go into my first list or to my second list, but it should be on the list either way on one of them. But I'm going to put it on this one, the Alinea book, Grant Achatz, legend. He's on the Mount Rushmore of chefs. And when that book came out, again, it was like no one was doing food like that in the United States until Grant. And I've talked about this before, but I was a chef in California at that time, around the time when that book came out. And I remember I had the El Bulli book. The El Bulli book came with a CD, and then I had the Alinea book. And I was doing that style of cuisine out in California before people were really thinking about it. And I just remember thinking like that Alinea book was like light years ahead of everything else, because I'd have my scales out with my alginate doing that kind of food. It was just advanced for the time. It was like Grant Achatz, Wiley Dufresne. I can't remember who else was doing it in the U.S. Homaro Cantu from Moto, but I think they were really the only three. And I dabbled in it a little bit in California, and I didn't get too much into it because, when I started, I think I left that restaurant within a year before I could really make my name doing that kind of food. But anyway, we digress. Those are my book recommendations. I'm sure I missed some. I should probably include a list of books that you could read, right? I could probably do it real fast, like Anthony Bourdain. Boom. Okay, next. Add in Marco Pierre White's book, The Devil in the Kitchen, and then everything else, right? Anyway, that's going to wrap up the show today. If you want to support the show, you know what to do. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, thumbs up, leave a comment. If you're on Spotify, make sure you leave 5 stars. Nothing less than 5 stars. 5-star podcast, right? If you didn't leave 5 stars, that would be very bad of you. And you're not a bad person, are you? Anyway, you know what to do. Go to chefspsa.com. You can get the Food Cost Mastery Guide. It's for free. You get all the other books, Culinary Leadership Fundamentals, Bad Sous, Good Chef, Line Cook Survival Manual, and the rest of them are available. Multiple languages, English, Spanish, Italian. You should have all of them on your bookshelf in your kitchen, and every single one of your cooks should have the red book and the white book on their clipboard. Thank you all very much. See you next week. Hit the porno music.